Hey guys, tonight we begin with a scream that echoed through stone walls 700 years ago. A child's voice, desperate and terrified, calling out in the dead of night. But here's what makes your blood run cold. No one was hurting him. No one was even in the room. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's dive deep into the darkest fears that haunted medieval children. Fears so real, so terrifying, that they shaped an entire generation's nightmares. Because what these kids were afraid of wasn't monsters on the bed or scary stories. It was something much, much worse. One, the night terror no one warned them about. Picture this. England, 1348. A young boy named William, only 8 years old, lives in his family's manor house. Stone walls thick as a man's arms surround him. Heavy wooden doors with iron locks protect every entrance. He should feel safe. But every single night, William wakes up screaming. His parents rush to his room. They find him sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror, pointing at the wall. "The voices," he whispers. "They're calling my name from inside the stones." At first, his mother thinks it's just childhood fears, bad dreams, growing pains. But then she hears it too, a soft scratching sound like fingernails on stone. Then whispers barely audible but definitely there, coming from inside the wall itself. Night after night, the sounds get louder, more desperate. William stops sleeping. He becomes thin and pale, jumping at every shadow. His parents call the local priest, who sprinkles holy water on the walls and mutters prayers in Latin. The scratching stops for exactly one night. Then it comes back stronger than before. What William's family didn't know was that their manor house was built on top of an old cemetery. During construction, workers had simply built over the graves, trapping the dead beneath layers of stone and mortar. The scratching sounds? They were real. Bodies had been buried alive during the plague, and some had clawed at their coffin lids until their fingers bled. Medieval children lived with this kind of terror every single day. Their homes were built on burial grounds, battlefields, execution sites. The dead weren't just stories to them. They were neighbors trapped in walls, crying out for help that would never come. But the voices in the walls were just the beginning, because medieval childhood was about to get much, much darker. 2. School was a dungeon. Imagine walking into your classroom and seeing bloodstains on the floor. Not from an accident, not from a fight, from yesterday's lesson. Medieval schools weren't places of learning. They were chambers of terror. Children as young as 5 years old were beaten with wooden rods for the smallest mistakes. Forgot a Latin word? 5 strikes across the knuckles. Spoke in your native language instead of Latin? 10 lashes across the back. Let me tell you about Thomas, a 7-year-old boy from a merchant family in France. His crime? He wrote the letter Q backwards during his writing lesson. The schoolmaster, a thin man with cold eyes, made Thomas kneel in front of the entire class. Then he took out his rod, a piece of oak wood, smooth from years of use. "Hold out your hands," the master commanded. Thomas knew what was coming. All the children did. They watched in silence as the rod came down across Thomas's tiny palms. Once, twice. By the 5th strike, Thomas was crying. By the 10th, his hands were bleeding. But here's what made it worse. The other children weren't allowed to comfort him. They weren't even allowed to look away. They had to watch, knowing that any mistake could put them in Thomas's place. Medieval children lived in constant fear of making errors. They memorized hundreds of Latin phrases they didn't understand, copied letters until their fingers cramped, and recited prayers in perfect order. One slip, one forgotten word, one moment of childish distraction, and they would feel the bite of the rod. The schoolmasters believed that pain was the only way children could learn. "Spare the rod, spoil the child," they said. But these weren't gentle corrections. These were brutal beatings that left children scarred both physically and mentally. Some children stopped speaking altogether, too afraid that their words might be wrong. Others developed nightmares about their teachers. dreaming of endless lessons where every answer brought more pain. But what they found next changed everything, because the terror wasn't just coming from inside the classroom walls. 3. The friendly which who told stories. Her name was Old Marta, and she came to the village every month with a cart full of stories. Children would gather around her in the town square, eager to hear tales of brave knights and magical kingdoms. She seemed harmless, a wrinkled old woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice. But Marta's stories weren't fairy tales. They were warnings, dark, twisted lessons that planted seeds of fear in young minds. "Listen well, little ones," she would say, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The forest animals aren't what they seem. That friendly rabbit you saw yesterday? At night, it stands on 2 legs and knocks on cottage doors with human hands. The deer that drinks from your well? It watches your family through the windows, counting how many children sleep in each bed." 8-year-old Elena, a baker's daughter, heard these stories and never felt safe again. Every animal she saw during the day became a potential threat at night. The cat that rubbed against her legs might be planning to steal her breath while she slept. The birds in the trees might be spying on her family, reporting back to dark forces in the forest. Marta told stories of children who ventured too far from home and returned different. Their parents would notice small changes. A child who no longer cast a shadow, or whose reflection didn't appear in water. Children who spoke in whispers and only came out at night. "The forest spirits are always watching," Marta would warn. "They're looking for children to replace the ones they've lost. Good, obedient children who won't ask too many questions." These stories spread from child to child like wildfire. Soon, entire villages of children were afraid to go outside after sunset. They would peer through shuttered windows, convinced they could see glowing eyes watching them from the tree line. Parents thought Marta was just entertaining the children with harmless folk tales. They didn't realize she was creating a generation of kids who saw danger in every shadow, threat in every rustling leaf. But the stories were just the beginning, because medieval children were taught that even the ground beneath their feet could betray them. 4. Don't step on the wrong symbol. Medieval children learned to watch where they walked, not for holes or puddles, but for symbols carved into stones drawn in dirt or etched into wooden door frames, because stepping on the wrong mark could damn their souls forever. 9-year-old Peter learned this lesson the hard way. Playing with friends in the village square, he accidentally stepped on a pentagram someone had scratched into a paving stone. The other children gasped and backed away from him. "You've called them," whispered his best friend, Marcus. "The demons know where you are now." Peter tried to laugh it off, but deep down, he was terrified. That night, he lay in bed listening for strange sounds, watching for shadows that moved without light to cast them. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every distant animal cry made him certain that something was coming for him. Medieval villages were covered in protective symbols, crosses, circles, ancient runes that predated Christianity, but mixed among them were darker marks. Symbols that supposedly opened doorways to hell, or called forth evil spirits, or marked the soul for collection by demons. Children were taught to recognize these symbols from an early age. They learned that a reverse cross meant the devil had been summoned, that certain combinations of lines and circles could curse an entire family, that even looking at some symbols for too long could invite evil into their hearts. The village playground became a minefield of supernatural danger. Children would hop and skip around mysterious marks, creating elaborate games to avoid stepping on anything that might be cursed. But the fear was real. They genuinely believed that one wrong step could destroy their immortal souls. Some children became so afraid that they refused to walk on any stone that had markings. They would take long, winding paths to avoid suspicious symbols, adding hours to simple journeys just to stay safe. And at night, when shadows made every scratch and scuff look like demonic writing, even their own homes felt dangerous. But what they discovered about the Watchers in the darkness, that's when true terror began. 5. The owl that watched you sleep. Medieval children were taught that owls weren't just birds. They were messengers of death, angels of darkness, spies for forces beyond human understanding. And when a child heard that distinctive hoo-hoo in the night, They knew someone was about to die. 11-year-old Sarah first heard the owl on a Tuesday night in October. She was lying in her small bed, sharing a room with her two younger sisters, when the sound drifted through their window, low and haunting. It seemed to echo off the walls of their cottage. Who? Sarah's blood turned to ice. She had been taught that owls could see into people's souls, that they perch outside the homes of those marked for death. The local priest had warned that these birds were sent by dark angels to count the living and report back to the realm of the dead. Night after night, the owl returned, always to the same tree outside Sarah's window, always with the same haunting call. Sarah stopped sleeping, convinced that the bird was watching her, studying her, deciding when her time would come. Her parents noticed her growing thin and pale, but they didn't take her fears seriously. "It's just a bird," her mother said. "Nothing to worry about." But 3 days later, Sarah's elderly grandfather fell ill with fever. Within a week, he was dead. The owl disappeared the same night grandfather died. For Sarah, this was proof that everything she'd been taught was true. The owl hadn't just been watching, it had been waiting, counting down the days until death arrived at their door. Medieval children lived with this constant sense of being observed by supernatural forces. Owls, ravens, black cats, all were seen as harbingers of doom, creatures that could predict death and disaster. Children would cover their windows at night, stuff cloth in the cracks under doors, anything to keep the watchers outside. But some houses had watchers inside as well, watchers that no cloth or shutters could keep out. 6. Family secrets in locked rooms. In medieval castles and manor houses, there were always rooms that children weren't allowed to enter, doors that stayed locked, hallways that were forbidden, entire wings of buildings that were off limits. And when children asked why, adults would get the same terrifying answer: some things are better left undisturbed. 10-year-old Robert lived in his uncle's castle, a massive stone structure with dozens of rooms and corridors. But there was one door on the 3rd floor that was always locked. Thick oak wood bound with iron. It looked like it was built to keep something in rather than keep people out. Never ask about that room. His uncle warned him on his first day, never try to open that door. And if you ever hear sounds coming from inside, come find me immediately. Of course, this only made Robert more curious. At night, he would sneak up to the 3rd floor and listen at the locked door. Most of the time, there was only silence. But sometimes, just sometimes, he heard things that made his skin crawl. Scratching sounds, like fingernails on stone. Soft weeping that seemed to come from more than one voice. And once, just once, the sound of chains dragging across the floor. Robert's nightmares began immediately. He dreamed of opening that door and finding a room full of prisoners, people who had been locked away and forgotten. He dreamed of pale hands reaching out from the darkness, begging for release. He dreamed of voices calling his name, pleading with him to set them free. The truth was often worse than the nightmares. Many medieval families did keep dark secrets behind locked doors. Some rooms held family members who had gone insane and were hidden away to avoid shame. Others contained evidence of crimes, torture devices, or religious artifacts considered too dangerous for children to see. Children grew up knowing that their own homes held horrors they couldn't imagine. They walked past locked doors every day, wondering what lay beyond, too afraid to ask but unable to stop thinking about it. And when they finally fell asleep, exhausted by fear and curiosity, they had to face the medical practices that made even healing a source of terror. 7. Bedtime with bloodletting tools nearby. Medieval children went to sleep, knowing that getting sick meant having their blood drained from their bodies. In every home, parents kept collections of knives, leeches, and cupping devices ready to cure any illness by releasing the bad blood that was supposedly causing the problem. 7-year-old and knew exactly where her mother kept the bloodletting tools. In a wooden box beside the family's bed, wrapped in clean cloth, were the instruments that could save her life or end it. Sharp knives for making cuts in arms and legs, glass cups for drawing blood to the surface. And most terrifying of all, a collection of leeches in a ceramic jar, black and slimy, waiting to attach themselves to human skin. When and develop a fever, Her mother didn't give her medicine or extra blankets. Instead, she brought out the box of tools and watched in horror as her mother unwrapped a small, sharp knife and heated it over a candle flame. "This will make you better," her mother said, but her hands were shaking. "The bad blood needs to come out." The knife cut deep into Anne's arm, releasing a flow of bright red blood into a ceramic bowl, and screamed. But her mother held her down, convinced that this torture was necessary to save her daughter's life. But the real horror came next. Her mother opened a jar of leeches and selected 3 fat, black specimens. She placed them on Anne's arms and watched as they latched onto her skin, their bodies swelling as they drank her blood, and could feel them moving, sucking, growing large as they fed on her. She begged her mother to take them off, but was told to wait until they were full and would drop off naturally. Medieval children lived with the knowledge that being sick meant being tortured. They saw siblings and friends subjected to bloodletting, watched family members grow weaker after treatments that were supposed to make them stronger. Many children became terrified of showing any signs of illness, hiding fevers and pain to avoid the cure that might be worse than the disease. But the medical horrors were nothing compared to the toys that watched them play. 8 dolls with human hair. The doll looked almost alive. Its painted wooden face smiled sweetly. Its tiny dress was carefully stitched, and its hair was real, soft, brown, and familiar. 6-year-old Margaret received the doll as a gift from her grandmother, just 2 weeks after her older sister died of plague. The doll was beautiful, but something about it made Margaret's skin crawl. The hair looked exactly like her sister's hair. The same color, the same texture, even the same length. Where did the hair come from? Margaret asked her grandmother. Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears. "From someone who loved you very much," she whispered. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The doll sat on her bedside table, its painted eyes seeming to watch her in the darkness. The human hair caught moonlight streaming through the window, giving it an otherworldly glow. Medieval families often made dolls using hair from deceased relatives. They believed it kept the dead person's spirit close to the living, providing comfort and protection. But for children, these dolls were reminders of death, of the people they had lost, of their own mortality. Margaret began having dreams where her sister spoke to her through the doll. In the dreams, her sister's voice came from the doll's painted mouth, begging Margaret to join her in the realm of the dead. The doll would move on its own, walking across Margaret's room, leaving tiny footprints in the dust. Other children had similar experiences with their hair dolls. They reported that the dolls would change positions during the night, that the hair would grow longer, that they could hear whispers coming from inside the wooden heads. Parents thought they were giving their children comfort, but instead they were surrounding them with reminders of death and loss. Children slept with the hair of the dead watching over them, never knowing if the spirits of their loved ones would try and protect them or take them away. But what they heard next would make them wish the dolls were their biggest worry. 9. The bell that means run. Every medieval town had a special bell, not the church bell that called people to prayer, not the bell that announced the time of day. This was different, larger, deeper, more terrifying. It was the plague bell, and when children heard it ring, they knew their world was about to end. 8-year-old David first heard the plague bell on a sunny morning in spring. He was playing in the village square with his friends when the deep, booming sound echoed across the rooftops. Every adult within hearing distance stopped what they were doing. Mothers grabbed their children. Fathers ran toward their homes. Market vendors abandoned their stalls. "What's happening?" David asked his mother as she pulled him toward their house. "The sickness is coming," she said, her face pale with terror. "We have to hide." The plague bell meant that disease had been spotted in a nearby village. It meant that death was traveling toward them, spreading from person to person, house to house, family to family. When the bell rang, entire communities would lock themselves in their homes and pray that the sickness would pass them by. For David, the sound of that bell became associated with pure terror. It meant weeks of being trapped inside, watching through shuttered windows as cart after cart rolled through the streets, loaded with bodies wrapped in sheets. It meant listening to the sounds of wailing from other houses, knowing that families were dying just a few doors away. Children who heard the plague bell learned to associate certain sound with death. The creak of cart wheels meant more bodies were being collected. The sound of hammering meant coffins were being built. The silence that followed meant entire families had died with no one left to mourn them. Some children develop a form of trauma where any bell, church bells, dinner bells, even small handbells, would send them into panic attacks. The sound had become permanently linked in their minds with the approach of death. But the terror of disease was nothing compared to what waited for them in the forests that surrounded their villages. 10. Forests were cursed, literally. Medieval children were taught that forests were not just dangerous, they were actively evil. Every tree, every shadow, every rustling leaf was potentially hostile. The woods weren't just home to wild animals or bandits. They were infested with demons, cursed spirits, and creatures that defied explanation. 9-year-old Catherine learned this lesson when her family moved to a cottage near the edge of Blackwood Forest. Her parents warned her never to go into the trees alone, never to wander off the main path, and never, ever to go into the woods after dark. Why? Catherine asked. Because the forest is hungry, her father said. It feeds on children who don't listen to their parents. At first, Catherine thought this was just a story to keep her from getting lost. But then she started hearing things. At night, when the wind blew through the trees, it sounded like voices calling her name. During the day, she would see shapes moving between the trunks, too large to be animals, too strange to be human. Medieval forests were associated with paganism, witchcraft, and ancient evil. Before Christianity spread through Europe, people worshipped forest gods and performed dark rituals among the trees. Children were taught that these old powers still lingered in the woods, waiting for unwary travelers. The sounds of the forest became threatening to young ears. The hoot of an owl was a death omen. The howl of a wolf meant demons were hunting. Even the innocent chirping of birds could be supernatural creatures calling to each other in coded messages. Catherine began having nightmares about the forest reaching out to grab her. In her dreams, tree branches would grow longer and wrap around her ankles, dragging her deeper into the darkness. She would try to scream, but the sound would be muffled by leaves that filled her mouth. Some children became so afraid of forests that they couldn't even look at trees without feeling panic. They would take long detours to avoid walking near wooded areas, even in broad daylight with adult supervision. But the fear of what lived in the forest was matched by the terror of what might be hiding in their own food. 11. Cursed food tales. Medieval children were told that food had feelings, that bread could become angry if you wasted it, that meat could curse you if you didn't eat it with proper gratitude, that fruits and vegetables could seek revenge if you refused to finish your meal. 5-year-old Emma was a picky eater. She would push vegetables around her plate, hide chunks of meat under her bread, and try to sneak unwanted food to the family dog. Her mother grew tired of this behavior and decided to teach Emma a lesson. The carrots you threw away last night, her mother said, they're very angry with you. They spent months growing in the ground, working hard to become sweet and nutritious, and you treated them like garbage. Emma laughed, thinking this was a silly joke, but her mother's expression was deadly serious. Wasted food doesn't just disappear, her mother continued. It comes back. It haunts children who don't appreciate what they have. Tonight, when you're sleeping, those carrots are going to visit you. They're going to whisper in your ear about how much you hurt them. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house became the ghost of rejected food, coming to seek revenge. The creaking floorboards were potatoes rolling across the floor. The wind through the shutters was the angry voices of vegetables she had refused to eat. Medieval parents used food-based fear stories to control their children's eating habits. In a time when food was scarce and every meal was precious, wasting food was considered a serious sin. Children were taught that discarded food would return as vengeful spirits, that picky eating could bring curses upon the entire family. Emma began forcing herself to eat everything on her plate, no matter how much she disliked it. She was terrified that leaving even a single bite would result in supernatural punishment. Other children developed similar fears, choking down spoiled food or eating until they were sick rather than risk the wrath of the food spirits. But the terror of cursed food was nothing compared to what families kept hidden in their basements. 12. The basement and its chains. Medieval houses often had cellars, dark underground chambers used for storage. But some families kept something else in their basements: chains. Heavy iron chains attached to the walls, supposedly for driving out demons from family members who had become possessed. 12-year-old William discovered his family's secret when he was exploring the cellar one afternoon, behind stacks of grain sacks and wine barrels. He found a section of wall with iron rings embedded in the stone. Attached to the rings were chains, each ending in heavy metal shackles that looked like they were made to fit around human wrists and ankles. The chains were stained with rust or something darker. When William asked his father about the chains, his father's face went white. "Those are for protection," he said quietly. "Sometimes the devil gets into people, especially children. When that happens, the only way to save them is to chain them up until the evil spirit leaves." William learned that his own uncle had been chained in that basement 20 years earlier. The family believed he had been possessed by demons because he had fits of rage and spoke in strange voices. They had kept him chained underground for 3 months, bringing him bread and water once a day, until he finally became calm and docile. Medieval families genuinely believed that mental illness, epilepsy, and other conditions were signs of demonic possession. Children who showed any unusual behavior, hyperactivity, mood swings, learning difficulties, risked being labeled as possessed and subjected to horrific treatments. William became terrified of showing any strong emotions. He worried that laughing too loudly, crying too hard, or getting angry about anything might convince his parents that he was possessed. He started monitoring his own behavior constantly, suppressing natural childhood feelings to avoid being chained in the basement like his uncle. Other children in medieval families lived with similar fears. They knew that acting different in any way could result in being branded as demon-possessed and subjected to torture in the name of salvation. But what they learned about their lullabies would haunt their dreams forever. 13. The real meaning behind lullabies. The song was supposed to help children sleep. Mothers would sing it softly while rocking their babies, their voices gentle and soothing. But if those children could understand the words they were hearing, they would never sleep peacefully again. Rockabye baby in the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. 7-year-old Mary loved it when her mother sang to her baby brother. The melody was beautiful and comforting. But one day, Mary asked her mother what the words meant. Her mother's face grew sad. "It's about children who are taken away," she explained. "Sometimes babies disappear from their cribs at night. The song is about how quickly a child can be lost." Medieval lullabies were filled with dark themes that reflected the harsh realities of life. Songs about children falling from great heights, being stolen by strangers, or simply vanishing without explanation. Parents sang these songs not to comfort their children, but to prepare them for a world where death and loss were constant companions. Mary began listening more carefully to the lullabies her mother sang. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird won't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring." The song went on, promising gift after gift, but always with the understanding that each gift would somehow fail or break. Child psychologists today would be horrified by medieval lullabies. Songs that should have provided comfort instead planted seeds of anxiety and fear. Children went to sleep hearing about disasters, abandonment, and loss, their subconscious minds absorbing messages about the dangerous, unpredictable nature of the world. Some children developed sleep disorders because of these lullabies. They would lie awake at night, afraid to close their eyes because the songs had convinced them that sleep was when bad things happened to children. But the songs were just the beginning of the supernatural terrors that filled their nights. 14. The fire that stays lit by itself. In the village church, there was a candle that never went out, not because someone kept lighting it, not because it was protected from wind and rain. It stayed lit because the dead were keeping it burning. 10-year-old Benedict first noticed candle during Sunday Mass. While other candles flickered and died throughout the service, this one burned with steady, unwavering flame. When he asked his mother about it, she made the sign of the cross and whispered, "That's the soul light. The spirits of the dead keep it burning so they can find their way to heaven." Benedict couldn't stop staring at the candle. The flame seemed different from ordinary fire, colder somehow, despite giving off heat. And sometimes, if he looked very carefully, he could swear he saw faces in the flame. Pale, translucent faces of people he didn't recognize, their mouths open as if they were screaming silently. Medieval churches often had eternal flames that were believed to be maintained by supernatural forces. Children were taught that these flames were gathering places for souls who had died but not yet reached their final destinations. The dead would cluster around the flames, drawing warmth and light from the fire while they waited for judgment. Benedict began having nightmares about the church candle. In his dreams, the flame would grow larger and larger until it filled the entire church. He would see hundreds of ghostly faces in the fire, all of them reaching toward him, begging him to join them in their eternal waiting. During church services, Benedict would find himself unable to concentrate on prayers or sermons. His eyes would be drawn to the soul light, watching for movement in the flame, listening for whispers that might be coming from the dead. He began to believe that the spirits could see him watching them, and that they were taking note of his interest. Some children became so obsessed with these supernatural flames that they would sneak into churches at night, hoping to communicate with the dead. Others became terrified of all fire, associating any flame with the presence of ghosts and spirits. But the terror of supernatural flames was nothing compared to what happened when religious authorities came to visit their homes. 15, when priests came to visit. The knock on the door came at sunset. 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through the entire house. 8-year-old Sophie ran to answer it, expecting to see a neighbor or traveling merchant. Instead, she found Father Marcus standing on her doorstep, his black robes making him look like a shadow given human form. "I need to speak with your parents," he said, his voice grave and serious. "There are concerns about this household." Sophie's blood turned to ice. When priests made unscheduled visits to homes, it meant one of 3 things. Someone was dying, someone was possessed, or someone was accused of witchcraft. None of these possibilities offered any comfort. Medieval children learned to fear visits from religious authorities. Priests had the power to declare entire families heretical, to order exorcisms, or to recommend execution for suspected witchcraft. When they appeared at your door unexpectedly, it meant your life was about to change forever. Sophie's parents invited Father Marcus inside, and the family gathered in their main room. The priest's eyes swept over each family member, lingering on Sophie and her younger brother, as if he were looking for signs of corruption or evil influence. "There have been reports," Father Marcus said slowly, "of strange lights seen in your windows at night. Neighbors have heard chanting coming from this house, and several people have mentioned that your children seem different lately." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She knew exactly what the priest was talking about. Her mother had been teaching her and her brother old songs that her grandmother had passed down, folk songs from before Christianity came to their region. They weren't evil songs, just traditional melodies about harvest time and changing seasons. But to the church authorities, any non-Christian tradition was potentially demonic. "We're going to need to examine the children," Father Marcus announced, "to determine if they've been exposed to unholy influences." Medieval children lived in constant fear of being accused of witchcraft or demonic possession. Simple childhood behaviors, talking to imaginary friends, having nightmares, being afraid of the dark, could be interpreted as signs of supernatural corruption. When priests came to investigate, children faced interrogations that could result in their families being broken up, their parents being arrested, or worse. Sophie and her brother were separated and questioned for hours. The priest asked them about their dreams, their fears, their games, their prayers. He wanted to know if they had ever seen strange creatures, heard voices that others couldn't hear, or felt compelled to do things they couldn't explain. For medieval children, these visits were proof that the adult world was constantly watching them, looking for signs that they were becoming vessels for evil forces. They learned to hide their natural childhood behaviors, to suppress imagination and curiosity, to present themselves as perfect little Christians at all times. But what they discovered about the written word would make them question everything they thought they knew about learning and knowledge. 16, writing was forbidden magic. The marks on the parchment looked like tiny insects crawling across the page, black scratches and curves that somehow contained human thoughts and words. To 11-year-old Thomas, a peasant boy who had never learned to read, writing looked like the most dangerous magic imaginable. His village priest could make those marks, and when he read them aloud, voices from the past would speak through his mouth. The priest could look at markings made by people who had died centuries ago and hear their exact words. If that wasn't witchcraft, Thomas didn't know what was. Medieval peasant children were taught that writing was a form of sorcery available only to priests and nobles. The ability to capture human speech in marks on paper seemed supernatural to people who had never learned to read. Children believed that scribes were dabbling in dangerous magic, trapping souls in ink and parchment. Thomas was terrified when he found a piece of parchment with Latin writing on it. The letters seemed to move and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. He was convinced that the words were alive, that they were trying to escape from the page and enter his mind. "Don't touch it," his mother screamed when she saw him holding the parchment. "Those are devil marks. They'll curse you." She snatched the paper away and threw it into the fire, where it curled and blackened as the letters seemed to writhe in the flames. Thomas watched in horror, certain that he had just witnessed the destruction of trapped souls. Medieval children who couldn't read developed elaborate superstitions about written text. They believed that certain combinations of letters could summon demons, that reading books could allow evil spirits to enter through your eyes, that writing your own name could give witches power over you. Some children became so afraid of written words that they would run away if they saw anyone making marks on paper or parchment. Others developed phobias about churches and monasteries, where they knew dangerous written magic was being practiced every day. The fear of writing extended to all forms of symbolic communication. Children were afraid of road signs, merchant marks, even simple drawings that might be mistaken for magical symbols. But what they learned about children who were different was perhaps the most horrifying discovery of all. 17. The cage for possessed kids. Picture a child, maybe 8 years old, sitting in a wooden cage barely big enough for their small body. Their legs are cramped. Their back aches from staying in one position for hours. And everyone who walks by stares at them like they're some kind of monster. This was reality for medieval children who were different, who moved too much, who spoke strangely, who saw things others couldn't see, who couldn't learn the way other kids learned. When children displayed behavior that adults couldn't understand, what we might recognize today as ADHD, autism, trauma responses, or learning disabilities, medieval society had a simple, brutal solution: cages. These weren't metaphorical prisons. These were actual wooden or iron enclosures, built specifically for children. Some were so small that kids couldn't even stand up inside them. Others had bars so close together that little arms couldn't reach through. The cages were scattered throughout medieval communities. In monastery courtyards where monks would pray over the possessed children. In village squares where everyone could witness the cleansing. In family homes where parents locked away their own kids rather than face the shame of having a demon child. Thomas was 7 when his parents first put him in the cage. He couldn't sit still during prayers. He asked too many questions. He laughed at inappropriate times. The village priest declared him touched by Satan, and his own mother agreed. For 3 days, Thomas sat in that wooden box while adults debated his fate. He begged to use the privy. He cried for water. He promised to be good, to sit still, to never ask questions again. But the cage wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. Adults believed that by confining a child's body, they could drive out whatever evil possessed their soul. Some children spent weeks in these cages. They were fed scraps like animals. They relieved themselves where they sat, because no one would let them out. They developed sores from the rough wood and infections from the filthy conditions. The psychological torture was even worse than the physical pain. These children could hear other kids playing outside their prisons. They could smell food they weren't allowed to eat. They could see their families go about their lives as if the caged child had already died. But what haunted these children most wasn't the confinement itself. It was the eyes. The constant staring from adults who looked at them with disgust, fear, or morbid curiosity. The pointing fingers of other children who whispered, "That's what happens when the devil gets inside you." Some caged children broke quickly. They learned to sit perfectly still. speak only when spoken to, and show no emotion that might be considered demonic. They became hollow versions of themselves, trading their personalities for freedom. Others held out longer, maintaining hope that someone would recognize their humanity. But medieval society had no concept of child psychology or developmental differences. A kid who couldn't focus was lazy or possessed. A child who spoke to imaginary friends was consorting with demons. A young person whose body moved differently was clearly marked by evil. The cages became symbols of what medieval childhood really was. A constant performance of normalcy in a world that punished difference with isolation and shame. Maria spent her 9th birthday in a cage because she claimed she could see angels. Her visions brought comfort to other children, but terrified the adults who saw them as proof of supernatural contact. She sat alone on the day she should have been celebrating, watching through iron bars as life continued without her. The most heartbreaking part wasn't just the physical suffering. It was how these caged children internalized a message that their very existence was wrong, that their thoughts, their movements, their way of being in the world was so fundamentally evil that they deserved to be locked away from human society. When children were finally released from the cages, if they were released, they emerged as different people. They learned to monitor every thought, every gesture, every word for signs that might mark them as possessed again. They lived in constant fear of returning to that wooden prison. But perhaps most terrifying of all was how normal this seemed to everyone else. Parents who loved their children still put them in cages when priests recommended it. Communities that celebrated childhood still gathered to watch demon children suffer. The cages weren't hidden shamefully in basements. They were displayed openly as tools of godly correction. These children learned that love was conditional on conformity, that safety required the complete suppression of anything that made them unique, that their families would choose religious approval over their child's well-being. The cages for possessed kids weren't just medieval torture devices. They were symbols of society that feared difference so much it was willing to destroy its own children rather than try to understand them. And the children who survived this treatment, they grew up believing that there was something fundamentally wrong with who they were, that their natural impulses were dangerous, that the only way to be loved was to become someone else entirely. Some of these caged children never recovered. They spent their adult lives expecting rejection, punishment, isolation. Others became the very adults who would one day put their own different children in cages, perpetuating cycles of fear and misunderstanding. But what happened next would show that even cages couldn't contain every child's spirit. 18. Don't look in the mirror after midnight. The mirror in Agnes's house was covered with thick cloth every night, not because it was broken or ugly, but because her grandmother had made her promise. Never look into your reflection after the sun goes down, and especially never after midnight. Medieval children lived surrounded by folklore that turned everyday objects into sources of terror. But few things inspired more fear than mirrors after dark. The stories varied from village to village, but the core warning remained the same. Mirrors were windows between worlds, and midnight was when the barrier was thinnest. Children were told that if they stared into a mirror after midnight, they wouldn't see their current reflection. Instead, they'd see themselves as they would become aged, broken, scarred by all the horrors that awaited them in their future. But not just any future. The worst possible future. Eleanor was 12 when she broke the rule. Her friends had dared her to look into the polished metal mirror in her family's home at the stroke of midnight on All Hallows Eve. She crept from her bed, heart pounding, and approached the reflective surface as the church bells began to chime. What she saw, she claimed, haunted her for the rest of her life. Her reflection showed an old woman with hollow cheeks and empty eyes. Scars covered the face that looked back at her. Burn marks, she thought, or maybe the tracks left by some terrible disease. The older Eleanor in the mirror was missing teeth, missing fingers, and when she opened her mouth to scream, no sound emerged. Eleanor stumbled backward, covering her eyes, but the image was burned into her memory. For weeks afterward, she checked her face obsessively for signs that she was becoming the broken woman she'd seen. Every minor injury, every small illness, felt like the beginning of her transformation into that nightmare reflection. The worst part wasn't just seeing a terrible future. It was a certainty that this fate was inevitable, that no matter what choices she made, no matter how careful she was, she would become that hollow-eyed woman in the mirror. But Eleanor's story was mild compared to what other children claimed to see. Some reported that their midnight reflections showed them as corpses, pale, still, with coins covering their eyes for burial. Others saw themselves as adults, but wrong somehow, with extra limbs, twisted faces, or eyes that held no human recognition. Young William swore he'd seen himself grown up, but with his mouth sewn shut, as if he'd been punished for speaking forbidden words. Little Catherine claimed her future self had no reflection at all in the mirror behind her, meaning she was already dead and just didn't know it yet. The most terrifying stories came from children who said their reflections moved independently. They'd see themselves reaching out from the other side of the mirror, try and pull their current selves through some darker version of the world. Parents didn't dismiss these tales as children's imagination. They believed mirrors could show supernatural truths, and they feared what their children might learn about their destinies. Some families removed all reflective surfaces from their homes after sunset. Others hung blessed crosses over mirrors or sprinkled holy water on them each evening. A few parents went so far as to blindfold their children at night, ensuring they couldn't accidentally glimpse their reflections. But mirrors weren't the only reflective surfaces children learned to fear after dark. Still water in buckets, polished shields, even the surface of wine in a cup could become windows to unwanted futures. Children developed elaborate rituals to avoid accidental reflection viewing. They'd close their eyes when passing water barrels at night. They'd turn away from any shiny surface after the sun set. Some kids slept with blankets over their heads to prevent seeing their faces reflected in chamber pots or metal bowls. The fear became so ingrained that many children couldn't look at their own reflections during daylight hours without feeling anxious. They'd scan their faces for signs of the future horrors they might see if they ever broke the midnight rule. Some children reported that the midnight mirror didn't just show their own futures, it showed them the fates of everyone they loved. They'd see their parents age and dying, their siblings marked by tragedy, their friends transformed into strangers. These visions created a generation of children who feared not just death, but the slow decay of everything they cared about. They learned that love was temporary, that beauty faded, that everyone they cherished would eventually become something unrecognizable. The mirror folklore served a deeper purpose in medieval society. It taught children that vanity was dangerous, that looking too closely at yourself invited supernatural punishment. It reinforced the idea that the future was predetermined and largely tragic. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the Midnight Mirror stories was how they stole hope from children who already had so little. In a world where childhood was brief and often brutal, these tales suggested that adulthood would be even worse. Children who glimpsed their midnight reflections often became withdrawn and fatalistic. Why plan for a future that would be filled with suffering? Why dream of better days when the mirror had already shown them their inevitable doom? Agnes never broke her grandmother's rule about the covered mirror, but she spent her entire childhood wondering what she might see if she did. The unknown became almost worse than the knowing, because her imagination filled in details that were probably more terrible than any actual reflection could have been. And late at night, when she heard other children whispering about their midnight mirror experiences, Agnes would pull her blankets tighter and try not to think about the cloth-covered surface hanging on her wall, waiting in the darkness to show her secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to learn. But the mirrors weren't the only source of supernatural whispers in medieval homes. Something else was calling to children from within the very walls themselves. 19. Whispers in the Chimney. Young Peter first heard the voices when he was 6 years old, sitting by the fireplace on a cold winter night. Soft whispers drifted down from the chimney, speaking words he couldn't quite understand, but that made his skin crawl with fear. His mother was mending clothes by candlelight. His father was sharpening tools for the next day's work. Neither of them seemed to hear what Peter heard, voices that seemed to be calling his name from somewhere far above in the darkness. Medieval homes were heated by fireplaces, and children often heard sounds coming from the chimneys. But adults claimed these weren't just echoes or wind. They were the voices of the damned, seeking new souls to drag into their eternal torment. The folklore explained it simply. when witches were burned at the stake. Their souls traveled up through smoke and flame, becoming trapped in the chimney systems of homes throughout the land. And they were angry, they were hungry, and they wanted company. Late at night, when fires burned low and families prepared for sleep, children would hear the whispers beginning, soft at first, like distant conversation, then growing clearer, more insistent, more personal. Some children reported hearing their own names called repeatedly from above. Others claimed the voices spoke in languages they didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Promises of power, threats of punishment, invitations to climb up and join the spirits in their smoky realm. The most terrifying reports came from children who said the voices weren't trying to lure them upward, but planning to come down. Little Margaret swore she heard detailed discussions about which nights the spirits would descend to the chimney to steal children from their beds. She claimed they debated which kids would be easiest to take, which families would notice quickly, which children would make the least noise. These weren't random supernatural encounters. The chimney spirits seemed to know intimate details about each household. They knew which children were afraid of the dark, which ones had been disobedient, which ones their parents loved least. Some kids reported that the voices grew louder during storms, as if the wind carried more spirits to their chimney. The rain and thunder would mask the sounds from adults' ears, but children could still hear the whispers planning and plotting in the darkness above. Others claimed the voices only came on specific nights, the anniversaries of which burnings in their area. These children learned to dread certain dates, knowing they'd spend those nights listening to the angry dead, discussing their revenge. Parents couldn't deny the chimney phenomena entirely, because too many children reported similar experiences. But they couldn't silence the voices either, which made them feel helpless and afraid. Some families tried hanging blessed objects near their fireplaces. Crosses, religious medals, herbs that priests claimed would ward off evil spirits. Others sealed their chimneys completely during certain seasons, preferring to freeze rather than risk supernatural contact. But the voices seemed to adapt to these defenses. Children reported hearing whispers coming from sealed chimneys, as if the spirits had found ways to speak through stone and mortar. Some claimed the voices moved other parts of the house when the chimney was blocked, speaking from the spaces between walls or calling from beneath floorboards. The worst part for many children was that the whispers seemed to know their secrets. The voices would reference things kids had done wrong, thoughts they'd try to hide, fears they'd never spoken aloud. Young Thomas claimed the chimney spirits knew about the apple he'd stolen from a neighbor's tree. They whispered about it constantly, threatening to tell the adults unless he climbed up to join them. The guilt and fear kept him awake for weeks, jumping at every sound from above. Some children became so terrified of the chimney voices that they refused to sleep in rooms with fireplaces. They begged to share beds with older siblings or sleep in kitchens, anywhere that didn't have a direct connection to the spirit realm above. Others developed obsessive behaviors around fireplaces. They'd check and recheck that the fires were properly extinguished before bed. They'd stuff rags into chimney openings, try to muffle any sounds from above. Some kids slept with their heads covered, hoping blankets would block out the whispers. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the chimney voices was how they affected children's relationships with their families. Kids who heard these whispers often became withdrawn and suspicious, wondering if the spirit's knowledge of family secrets meant that someone in their household was communicating with the dead. The voices created paranoia that could tear families apart. Children would wonder if their parents had made deals with the chimney spirits. They questioned whether siblings were reporting their behavior to the supernatural entities above. Some children reported that the voices tried to turn them against their families directly. The spirits would whisper that parents didn't really love them, that siblings were planning to hurt them, that the only beings who truly understood them were the dead souls in a chimney. These whispers could drive wedges between family members that lasted lifetimes. Children who grew up hearing chimney voices often became adults who couldn't trust fully, who always listened for signs of supernatural manipulation in human relationships. The chimney spirits also served as a form of social control that extended beyond individual families. Children learned that the dead were always watching, always listening, always ready to punish those who stepped out of line. But the voices weren't just threatening. Sometimes they were seductive, promising knowledge and power to children who felt powerless in their daily lives. The spirits claimed they could teach kids how to read the future, how to influence adults' decisions, how to get revenge on enemies. Some children admitted they were tempted by these offers. In a world where they had no control over their circumstances, the idea of supernatural allies was appealing, but the adults warned that any bargain with chimney spirits would eventually demand a child's soul as payment. Young Anna claimed she'd spoken back to the voices once, asking them questions about her future. She said they answered with frightening accuracy, predicting her grandmother's death 3 days before it happened. But afterward, the voices became more demanding, insisting she owed them a debt that would eventually need to be repaid. The chimney whispers represented everything medieval children feared about the adult world: invisible watchers, secret knowledge, powers beyond their understanding, and the constant threat that supernatural forces were documenting their every mistake. As Peter grew older, the voices in his chimney became less frequent. But he never forgot the feeling of being watched from above, of having his private moments invaded by entities that knew his secrets and judged his worth. And when he became a father himself, Peter found himself listening carefully to his own children's reports of chimney voices, wondering whether the cycle was beginning again. But these whispers from burned spirits were just one part of a larger truth about medieval childhood, a truth that reveals just how normalized fear had become in their daily lives. 20. Growing up in fear was normal. As we reach the end of our journey into medieval childhood, the most haunting truth emerges not from any single terror, but from how completely normal all of this fear was considered to be. These children didn't grow up thinking their experiences were traumatic or unusual. They didn't have words for psychological damage or emotional abuse. They simply accepted that childhood meant living in constant terror, and that surviving to adulthood required learning to navigate a world designed to break them. Every morning, a medieval child woke up not knowing if this would be the day they died from disease, were taken by human predators, or finally succumbed to the supernatural forces that surrounded them. And everyone, parents, teachers, priests, neighbors, told them this was how childhood should be. Fear wasn't considered a problem to be solved. It was considered education. When little Sarah trembled at night because she heard voices in the chimney, adults didn't comfort her with explanations about wind and echoes. They added more warnings about what those voices might do to her if she listened too closely. When young Marcus couldn't concentrate in school because he was terrified of the punishment rod, teachers didn't wonder if fear might interfere with learning. They increased the beatings, believing that more fear would create more focus. When children woke screaming from nightmares about demons and death, parents didn't hold them and promise safety. They reminded the kids that the nightmares were probably visions of their sinful futures, warnings to behave better. This normalization of terror shaped every aspect of medieval childhood. Children learned to hide their fears because expressing them brought more punishment. They learned to comfort themselves because no adult would do it for them. They learned to find joy in tiny moments because they never knew when horror would strike again. But perhaps most heartbreakingly, they learned to do the same things to the next generation. The children who survived these experiences became the adults who put their own kids in cages for being different, who told their sons and daughters that chimney voices were real and dangerous, who beat knowledge into young minds because that's how they'd been taught. The cycle of fear perpetuated itself through generations because medieval society believed that childhood terror was not just inevitable, but beneficial. They thought fear taught children to respect authority, that supernatural threats kept kids obedient to religious teachings, that physical punishment created moral character, that early exposure to death and suffering prepared young people for adult realities. From our modern perspective, we might look back at these medieval children with pity. We might wonder how society could be so cruel to its most vulnerable members. But we should also feel something else: amazement. Because despite everything, despite the cages and the beatings and the supernatural terrors and the constant threat of death, these children found ways to survive. Not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. They created secret games that helped them process trauma. They formed bonds with other children that sustained them through unimaginable hardships. They developed an inner strength that allowed them to endure suffering that would break many modern adults. These medieval children, living in a world of nightmares, somehow managed to grow up and create beauty. They built the cathedrals that still inspire us today. They wrote the stories and songs that still move us. They developed the philosophical and artistic traditions that shaped our modern world. They fell in love and raised families and found meaning in lives that began with terror. They discovered hope in hopeless circumstances and created light in the darkest of worlds. When we study medieval childhood, we're not just learning about historical cruelty. We're witnessing the incredible resilience of the human spirit. We're seeing proof that children can survive almost anything and still manage to become fully human. These kids developed emotional survival skills that we can barely comprehend. They learn to find comfort in the smallest kindnesses, to create joy from nothing, to build inner worlds that external horrors couldn't touch. They mastered the art of living with uncertainty, of finding strength in vulnerability, of maintaining hope when hope seemed foolish. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that fear didn't have to define them, that even when everything around them was terrifying, they could choose how to respond. They could choose to be kind to other frightened children. They could choose to find beauty in brief moments of peace. They could choose to believe that tomorrow might be different, even when today was unbearable. The medieval children we've met in this story, Peter with his chimney voices, Agnes with her covered mirror, Thomas in his cage, Eleanor with her nightmare reflection, they weren't just victims of a cruel historical period. They were survivors, warriors, heroes of their own stories. They faced monsters that existed both in the supernatural realm and in the hearts of the adults who should have protected them. And somehow, impossibly, many of them won, not by defeating the monsters. That wasn't possible in their world, but by refusing to become monsters themselves, by maintaining their humanity in inhuman circumstances, by choosing love and hope and beauty, even when everything around them counseled despair. When we turn off the lights tonight and feel that familiar flutter of childhood fear, we should remember these medieval children. We should honor their courage and learn from their resilience, because they faced the worst that human imagination could create, and they survived. They grew up in a world designed to break them, and they chose instead to build something better for the future. They whispered stories to each other in the dark that weren't about fear, but about hope. They held hands when no adult would hold them. They shared the little food they had and created family bonds stronger than blood. They looked at a world full of terrors and decided that love was still possible. That childhood, even childhood lived in fear, could still contain moments of pure joy. These medieval children teach us that human beings are capable of enduring almost anything. That love is stronger than fear. That hope can survive in the most hopeless circumstances. And that childhood itself, the capacity for wonder, for play, for believing in better tomorrows, is so powerful that it can flourish even in the deepest darkness. The next time you see a child laughing, remember that laugh is the same sound that echoed through medieval streets despite everything we discussed tonight. It's the sound of the human spirit refusing to be conquered by fear. It's the sound of hope passed down through generations of children who lived through nightmares and chose to dream anyway. That's the real story of what medieval kids feared most. Not the demons or the diseases or the darkness itself. They feared that fear would win. But it didn't, and because of their courage, neither should we.